will continue. Again, this is the third out of 4 sessions that we're having looking at the Beatitudes. And as we have been doing, we'll begin just by reading through the entirety of the Beatitudes, just as a review for us. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so men persecuted the prophets who were before you. Okay. And so, I know I tend to do kind of the more general introduction, and just saying that our look at the Beatitudes is kind of under this rubric, faith, hope, and love. Faith was our examination last spring of the Nicene Creed. Hope is the hope we have through prayer, and the model prayer that we have is the Lord's Prayer. We looked at that in the fall. And then love has to do with our conduct as Christians. And so the 2 main examples that we see in traditional catechisms are the Beatitudes, which we're looking at this spring, and the Lord's Prayer, which we'll be looking at in the fall. So that's just kind of a reminder where we are. And so we have looked at the first 4 Beatitudes. So tonight we will look at the 5th and the 6th. So blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy, and blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. So I guess the departure point in looking at blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy, is understanding this idea of mercy within the context of our faith. I know that our common sense is that mercy is, it's things like, I guess the example is you're watching a gladiator movie and someone is besting the other gladiator and is about to dispatch that person, and they plead for mercy. So it's, have mercy on me, don't kill me. And we just have it in that kind of basic sense. Mercy as somehow getting someone off the hook, as it were, when they're in trouble. But our sense is mercy, kind of the equivalent is love, but in a very specific Christian sense of love. And a touchstone, and something that comes up often, is an example that we see in the life of the church that talks specifically about mercy as it looks at here, and it actually gets expanded in the presentations of this particular article in the catechisms, is the story that we will hear in the church in 3 Sundays. It's we call it the Sunday of the Last Judgment. For those of us who are more tuned into the fasting rules, it's meat fair. We say goodbye to meat until after Pascha. But that Sunday, it's a reading from the Gospel of Matthew, where he does talk about the return of the Son of Man at the end of history, and the dividing of all the people into sheep and the goats. So of course the sheep are at the right hand, the goats are at the left hand. And the question is, what are the criteria used for that? And so Jesus Christ says, well, you were hungry, I was hungry, you fed me, I was thirsty, you gave me drink, I was naked, you clothed me, I was in prison, you visited me, I was sick, you visited me. And of course the question is, well, when did we do that? And he said, well, when you did this to the least of me. So that kind of gives a picture there. So how mercy is talked about specifically in this context, and what we overwhelmingly tend to see and think about, is in terms of this gospel reading that we'll hear in a few weeks in church. And so there's more to it, though, than that. So the division that's made is when we talk about mercy and merciful acts, there are what can be called bodily works of mercy. And then there are what are considered spiritual works of mercy. So I just kind of ticked off real quick the things that are in that gospel reading. And they focus very much on bodily works of mercy. And so enumerated in traditional catechism, it is feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, visiting those in prison, visiting the sick, and this is specifically either to, depending upon how sick they are, you're either helping them recover from their illness and an encouragement, or if it's a grave illness, you're preparing them for their death. There's also this idea of hospitality to strangers and travelers and giving them a place of rest. And then this final one, burying the dead. Now, in hearing that, I think we can get a sense of how many of these are pretty straightforward. Most of our parishes do something along these lines. Of course, one of the big things here in the Cleveland area is we have St. Herman's House of Hospitality in Ohio City. It's essentially a men's shelter, but they also feed, they serve 3 meals a day to anyone in the surrounding community who needs a meal. And how they do that is food's donated, but also churches, primarily Orthodox churches, but not limited to Orthodox churches, will volunteer to go there, prepare a meal, and serve it. That's something that our parish does. So that's one way we as a parish feed the hungry. But it's also these other sorts of needs. Giving drink to the thirsty, giving clothing to the naked. I know that there are agencies and ministries where you can donate clothing and they're given to people who need clothes, who don't have clothing. It gets a little bit more involved, less common for rank and file lay people to do. Visiting those in prison. I think we probably all know and understand that there is a need for prison ministry, but that it is specialized work, but it does not have to land on clergy. I know that the tendency is that, especially within the context of the Orthodox Church, our prison ministry tends to be parish priests who happen to live near prisons and feel a calling to go and help with that sort of thing. But it's not limited to that. So there are lay chaplains who can be trained and prepared to do that. It's not limited just to the ordained folks. So that is a possibility. And something that we can secondarily support as just rank and file people in parishes is there is a national ministry, Orthodox Christian prison ministry. And so they will, like a number of these groups, they're officially recognized, they're officially sanctioned by the bishops of the church, and they may send things to parishes and say, please support our ministry, can you send a check, sort of thing. So we have a way of secondarily doing that as well. But it is the sort of thing where the further down on this list, it probably sounds less common for us. And I think this is an element, reading these things from a traditional catechism. And this probably applies more in the second part, spiritual works of mercy, that I'll get to. But I think there's an assumption here, because if you look at catechisms, they were typically prepared and used in traditionally Orthodox Christian societies. Most of the catechisms I'm looking at were written and used 200, 300, 400 years ago in Russia. pre-communist, pre-Putin Russia. And so, of course, the whole thing was everybody was an Orthodox Christian. It was uncommon to hear of anyone who was something else. And there was just part of the culture, this notion that you had a Christian duty to do certain things. And so it was more common for people to just say, well, this is something we all do, and step forward on it. And so a piece of this, especially the hospitality piece, if I say, well, you should be hospitable to strangers and travelers in your midst, that was more specifically pointed at pilgrims. So not the East Coast Plymouth Rock pilgrims, but people on pilgrimage. Let me clarify there. So it would be the sort of thing where a pious activity would be to go someplace and visit someplace that was special and considered holy. So it might be a special church, a church that might have a special icon, a church or a place where a saint may have lived, their relics may be there. And so in traveling, it was this thing of, well, I'm going from point A to point B. B is a holy place. Can I stop here for the night? Oh, you're doing something pious and you're traveling, but you are a fellow Christian. We will open our home, let you stay here, and provide hospitality for you. So that's kind of parsing out some of these aspects of bodily works that may sound a little off for us. There's a certain assumption there. I think what's trickier is, as I began, we hear this sermon, this reading that we preach on about the Last Judgment, and the focus in the presentation there is strictly on bodily works of mercy. But we're also told that there's a spiritual aspect as well. How are we merciful to others in a spiritual sense? And so what we are given here are, and I'll just read them as they come from the Catechism, and we can parse this out. So the first one, by word and example to convert the sinner from the error of his way, teaching the ignorant truth and goodness, dispensing good and timely advice to neighbors who are in distress or danger, comfort the grieving, that probably sounds a little more neutral, refraining from returning evil for evil, forgiving offenses with all one's heart, and praying to God for everyone. So I think the difficult thing there is more so than the first one. I think we still have a common sensibility that we have responsibility for the physical needs to some extent for people around us. There's somebody poor, we should probably figure out how to feed them. I think we would all still agree that that's something that we should do. I think the difficulty is when we start talking in the spiritual sense. Some of that language, we're assuming a Christian society, we're assuming one particular worldview, and the reality of what we navigate day to day is very pluralistic. I'll even say fragmented, because everyone kind of has their own thing that they rally around, and it's individualistic. Well, this is my business. It's really not anyone else's business, and I kind of, it kind of is playing off. If you want to bring in your First Amendment, we have freedom of religion in this country, and that can go to the extent of, well, I'm free to not believe anything, or I'm free to believe anything, and it can be things you put together on your own, not necessarily, I think it, kind of the traditional sense is you are free to believe any of the things that we see out there and recognize as religion, and saying, well, you have a freedom not to, or you can invent what you want. But the thing there is that for us to have some conversations with people, so if you walked up to somebody on the street and said, well, I'm here to convert you because you're a sinner, and I want to tell you about the error of your ways, I think by and large, if you weren't punched in the nose, the person would say thanks, but no thanks, and walk away. I think these sorts of things have to be nuanced because of the circumstances that we live in. It doesn't mean that we don't have to do them. It's just when and where and how we do that. And some of them are just, I guess some of the latter ones are more straightforward. So something like this: dispensing good and timely advice to neighbors who are in distress, danger. If your neighbor is upset about something that happened to them, you can talk to them and say, well, what's wrong? Tell me about it. I'm sorry you're feeling that. Here's kind of what comes to mind in terms of something that I don't have all the answers, but this might be something helpful. That's a fairly neutral interaction. It may become the sort of thing where it does go into questions of faith or what have you. I'm having a hard time with this. I'm kind of at wit's end. I'm not quite sure what to do. You go to church and seem to have your act together. What's that all about? That might provide an opportunity to have that conversation, and it may go in that direction. So that's kind of on the more neutral level. The thing that I tend to talk about, especially with regards to this thing of converting sinners and the error of their way, that's I still love that sort of thing. It says, by word and example to convert. And I know that in talking with parishioners, because sometimes the counsel that we have in our readings, and I'll present this in our homilies, if you are a Christian, part of your responsibility is you should be sharing your faith with other people. And parishioners will get nervous about that. Well, I don't know how to do that. That's kind of a difficult thing. And am I supposed to make a list and go out and kind of go through the list of who I need to talk to and all of that? And I say, well, no, it really comes more down to circumstance and the right circumstance to address those sorts of things. So part of it is example. If you're talking the talk, let me back up. If you're walking the walk, more so. If you're doing the things that you're supposed to be doing as a Christian, people see that. And ideally, that should set you apart. There's something different about you. And there's something different in a positive way. And I'm curious to know more about that. That's usually the time when you have a conversation with someone and say, oh, well, this is why I do these things. I go to a church. This is what I'm taught there. So you have the opening and the opportunity. You let the other person bring it up based on your behavior. I also will advise people to just be matter of fact about their faith. I'm an Orthodox Christian. I go to St. Luke's Orthodox Church. This is what we do on Sunday. It's giving factual information. It's not, grabbing someone by the collar and saying, have you accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior? And here's a free copy of the Gospel of John, and I want to tell you about the sinner's prayer. And once you say this prayer, good housekeeping stamp of approval, everything's okay here, and you're fine. And it's part of it too is invitation. So people that you share, well, I go to this church. This is something that my family does on Sunday. You can invite people to say, well, do you want to come to church sometime? And you can come with me, we'll figure it out. And they can say no. But that doesn't mean that you don't invite them. And something that helps is often, depending upon someone's circumstance, they don't have religious plans when we do religious things at certain religious times of the year. So a good example is Christmas. Here we have our Christmas service on Christmas Eve, 7 o'clock in the evening. And so depending upon what someone's doing, you can just say, well, my church, we do our Christmas service, 7 o'clock, Christmas Eve. Do you want to come and see what it's all about? No, thanks. I'd rather do my own thing. Or, well, that sounds interesting. I will come. In fact, that was something that before I was ordained, before I was married, before I was Orthodox, when I was in a Protestant denomination, that's what I did. And more often than not, I had takers. Maybe not the first time, but I would have takers. And in a few instances, people said, yeah, I'm comfortable with this, and this feels like a place I should be. And so in a few instances, I had friends who said, yeah, I want to start coming to your church. And it was all just a matter of, do you want to come see a church service? And being factual. So it doesn't have to be this heavy thing of like, okay, everybody's a sinner. I have this heavy task of converting them all, and the way to convert them is to present the error of their ways to them. I don't think a lot of relationships work very well with, you've got problems and I need to tell you what they are, and you'll be better for it after I've told you. I think that's what that approach tends to come down to. But you notice a difference here. So the bodily works of mercy have to do with physical needs. People who are hungry, people who are thirsty, people who are suffering because they're not clothed, people in physical circumstances that are uncomfortable or difficult. Prison, illness, traveling without shelter. And the spiritual works of mercy focus far more on what's happening inside of that person and what's going on with them. And some of these latter ones, they do tend to move more in the direction of well, what do I personally do here? So there is, we can comfort the grieving, refrain from returning evil for evil. So if someone treats you badly, you don't have to turn around and say, well, you so-and-so, and shake your fist and do something mean back to them. You can just say, okay, well, turn the other cheek. I'm going to move on from this. I'm going to walk away. Sometimes it's a literally walk away. I won't engage this. Sometimes it's difficult, forgiving the offenses with all one's heart. We have choices, but they're not necessarily easy choices. Okay, I need to forgive this person, but my gosh, that thing that they said or did made me really angry. And it's so much easier for me to do A, B, and C than to say, well, I need to just let go and forgive them. But that's something that we're commended to do. Forgive others with all our heart. And then the last one is, this should be straightforward, but I know that for some folks it not necessarily is. Praying to God for everyone. I know that we can have prayer lists and kind of organize them in certain ways. Well, here's like the sick people. Here are the people that are depressed. Here are the people that, I'm thinking of ones we have here in church. You know, we have folks that are severely ill. We have an expectant mother. We have a mom and a newborn. They kind of all get their own category. But we don't have an exclusion list. Well, there are people that can't be on this list, and these are all the people we're not going to pray for. And oftentimes, going through this, it is the sort of thing where I'm not returning evil for evil, and I'm forgiving the offenses of the other with all my heart. And probably the most fruitful, beneficial thing that I can do, because the interpersonal relationship is so bad and difficult, is I just need to pray for them, myself, and this circumstance. So quite often, our prayer can be for our enemies. And I mean that in the sense of we don't have true enemies, but gosh darn it, there are people that we can be really mad at. We pray for them. So that's kind of a picture of that first one. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And kind of parsing that out and having the second part, it's in the similar sense of what we hear in the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And the idea is, how can we ask for forgiveness if we don't forgive others? And so, similar token, how can we ask for mercy from God if we are not merciful to others? And this is just that promise. If you are, so it's turning it a little bit and saying, if you're merciful, God will be merciful with you. So, fifth beatitude. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. I have two reflection questions that I had for this beatitude. So to help in this regard, do I judge others harshly, or do I show compassion, understanding, and a gentle, forgiving spirit? So that kind of taps on a general way of approaching people and being merciful. And then the second one, when possible, do I help the poor, the hungry, the abused, the lonely, and others in need? And so I know that our tendency is we can see those things and say, well, not today, don't want to do that. But when possible, can I do this? Reminds me of a anecdote. I'll close with this anecdote for the fifth beatitude. We'll turn to the sixth. So when I was in seminary, we had an interesting figure at the school. This was the director of admissions. And it was quite an interesting thing. She was a woman who was in her late 20s. And as you know, it's very uncommon for people to be in administrative positions at colleges and universities at that age. Usually you're kind of at a junior level and you eventually work your way up. But she was very pious, devout Orthodox Christian. This was in Boston, and one of her things, and this is a story that we heard about. She actually died young. She died when she was 32. So this was after I graduated. So this is a story about her that I heard after she had died. Of course, whenever she was driving around Boston, big East Coast city, not uncommon to have homeless people on corners, and you get to a stop sign or a stoplight, and you're sitting there for a minute or two for someone to come over and say, "Can you please help me? I'm hungry." And so one of her things was, I guess, a statement she would make to whoever she was riding in the car with. And this was usually when they were in a hurry to get somewhere. She would say, "Do we pay or pray today?" And what that meant was, are we so busy that we continue going and we just pray for that person because we're in a hurry? Or do we stop? And even though we'll be late where we're going, do we give them some money to help them in their need? And it just kind of boiled down to that phrase, do we pay or pray? And just recognizing we have to do something for this person who's suffering. And I know that's a difficulty when you talk about helping the homeless in a major metropolitan area, because major metropolitan areas, there are so many homeless people that you could get, it's the compassion fatigue thing. How can you get from point A to point B if you're stopping and helping every single person that you see? But it's not saying you help no one. So, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. All right, our sixth beatitude is, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Now, we often hear this idea of pure in heart, and sometimes it's boiled down to the word purity. And we will equate that with this word chastity. And we just limit it to this whole thing about, how are we doing in terms of our sexuality, and just kind of limiting it to that. But it's actually a broader sense when we talk about purity, and more specifically being pure in heart. It's the idea of worldly detachment. And so part of it is, I mentioned sexuality. There's an appropriate place for sexuality in adult lives, specifically married adult lives. And so there's a question of outside of that. But we're not limited there. And the focus is not on that. It's this idea of proper and appropriate place for that, as opposed to taking it to extremes. But that's similar with other things in our lives. Money and possessions. things that we struggle with, pride, anger, all of that. It's how do we detach from the draw of the world and the worldly. And this is related to what we looked at last time. So, we had this fourth Beatitude. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. And if you recall, the parsing out there was righteousness, the replacement word being holiness. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for holiness, for they shall be filled. So it's those who strive to become holy. God will help in that effort, and they will be fulfilled in that. So that's talking about a desire and a push to move in this direction of holiness. And this is saying, if you go down that road and you do detach yourself from worldly concerns and find that, come to this place of purity in your heart, there's this idea of seeing God. I know I need to parse that out a little bit more. So the idea there, pure in heart, really saying, do we focus primarily on God? And do we focus how we live our lives primarily directed towards God and not getting stuck in all the things that upset us? It's not to deny those things, but how do we properly detach and move away from that? So it's this idea of being less attached to worldly pursuits. And so the more we're unencumbered by those, the easier it is to focus more on God. And it becomes this thing that really develops momentum over time. So the less worldly concerns we have, the more we focus on God, the more we're pulled in that direction. And, they use the language, see God. But the example I think that we see is that in describing this, we can look at the lives of the saints. And so their experience is not necessarily, like Old Testament. Well, I hid in the crevice of the rock, and God walked by, and I got to see his back, and I saw God, sort of thing. But more this sense of the more I detach from the worldly, the more I focus on God, the more I see what is godly around me and God's work in the world around me and God's presence in my midst. And so that's the sense that we have here. So there is this element. I know that in talking about holiness and pursuing holiness, that can talk about a change in our character. So I'm a different person today than I was how many ever years ago before I started doing pious, holy things and becoming a more pious, holy person. But it's also talking about and identifying, well, that work also has to do with a change in my relationship with God. There's less, I know sometimes I'll do it in these terms. I have old dated analogies, but I'm an old dated guy, so noise to signal ratio. So they'll talk about in broadcasts. So you broadcast a signal, and it goes through the air, and it's received somewhere else. And depending upon your receiving equipment and how well it's tuned in and what's happening with atmospheric conditions, there's noise. And so you'll have all kinds of strange things that will come and get picked up by the receiver along with the signal. And so it's this thing of how much noise and signal is there. And I know that back 100 years ago when radio was the burgeoning hot technology, that was a big part of what they had to contend with. How do we filter this in such a way that there's more signal than noise? So in the sense that we talk about here, this purity of heart is reducing the noise and doing as much as possible to amplify the signal. And so for us, it's how well we can focus on God and our relationship with God, and not so much on these other things that can distract us, interfere, noise, as it were. Now, what people will see in this is, as people develop purer hearts and are more focused on God in their lives, they overcome a number of things. So, a big part of this whole path is repenting of sins, and turn it, and so in the true sense of repentance, sin's over here, I turn away from it, I walk away, and actually developing the habit of not doing certain sins over time. And so what will happen is that there is, with this pure heart, a greater, an acuter sense of smaller sins. And so when you talk with a holy person, their concern might be, I had a conversation with you, and I know that the tone of my voice was harsh. You may not have heard something harsh, but there may have been something small in how they presented themselves that they understood, oh, that was a harsh thing that I did, even though it was minute. And so it's this interesting thing. The more holy someone is, the less serious objectively their sins are, but the more acutely they're aware of them, because they've kind of addressed all these other things. And the focus is so much more on that focus of God. Well, how do we approach this? I just got done talking about saints and their acute awareness of little sins. Well, interestingly enough, the advice that's given in catechisms about this is starting at a very basic level. And I am doing a commercial for Lent starts in a month. One of the primary places that this is talked about is the fasting practices of the church. And I know often I just say that and don't parse out what that means. Typical thing in the Orthodox Church is every Wednesday and Friday throughout the year, there are few exceptions, essentially are meatless, meat and dairyless. You change the type of food that you eat. You abstain from those particular foods 2 days a week. And the rationale there is Wednesday, you are remembering Judas's betrayal of Christ. And so it's kind of a more austere meal. And then of course every Friday, part of why you fast is it brings to mind Christ's crucifixion. Now the bigger piece that we get into is during Great Lent, we do that for a whole 40-day season. I know that often, the conversation might be, well, I think I'll give up, you'll hear people kind of coming up with things. What am I going to give up for Lent? And they have to figure out what they want to give up for Lent. And so it's things like, I won't drink coffee for Lent, or I won't eat chocolate for Lent. And the approach that we take in the Orthodox Church is, you're not eating meat or dairy for 40 days. That's what we say. Now, of course, we need to understand that my job is I'm not the food police. So it's not like you go and knock on people's doors at dinner time and say, well, what's on the table there? And are you keeping the fast? But the intention there is the discipline. What is the most basic passion that we have? Well, we have to eat. We will die if we don't eat. But we can tie ourselves in knots about the quality and the quantity of what we eat. I want a big steak with all the fixins and a baked potato, and there better be a nice big slice of cheesecake for dessert. We can do that. And so what the church says by saying, well, part of what we're going to do to prepare to celebrate Christ's resurrection at Pascha is we'll prepare by fasting. And that is your voluntary way of saying, well, I'm going to be careful about what I eat and how much, and deal with that thing of potential gluttony or obsessing about food. And it really can pop in. But if you're given okay, here's 40 days, and the reminder is at the very end of that, you're off the hook. And you can have whatever you want after that. But it's an exercise. And so the idea is that you are in that way starting and training yourself to do that, so that through the rest of the year, something like, well, Wednesday, no meat or dairy. I can do that because I did 40 days of this other thing. Kind of an interesting aside. I will often share with people, convert to the Orthodox Church. I converted in the crazy convert parish. So all of my fellow parishioners were crazy converts who were excited about becoming Orthodox. And our priest at the time was the crazy convert priest. And so there was a lot of, how well are you fasting during Lent? And are you keeping the rules? And it did take some odd turns. So you would have conversations, say, after liturgy during Lent, at coffee hour. I figured out how to make this food using substitute fasting things that's just as good or better than the non-fasting version.
That's the thing.
It's like, why do that? Because it's kind of, you're trying to reintroduce the pleasure piece. It's supposed to be difficult. It doesn't have to be horrible. I hear that probably the best place to get a meal during Great Lent is at a monastery, because monastics observe fasting throughout the year. And so they've gotten really good at, well, this is the only thing we eat. We have to eat food that's palatable, at least. And so they're very good at cooking palatable meals. They're not necessarily over the top, but that's what they can do. And probably the striking example of why I'm not the food police is I remember going to a weekday Lenten service, and afterwards going out to my car, and I was having a conversation with the priest, and unkempt bachelor that I was at the time, he looked in the car and saw a bag from the local hamburger place. And he was like, "Oh, what's that?" And honestly, I said, "Well, I'm trying to fast. I got French fries and a soda." He said, "Oh, well, their French fries are not very good." And he opened the car door and he took the bag out. He's like, "Yeah, I don't like eating." So it was kind of this small talk, but he got the bag out and opened it and looked inside to make sure that the only thing in there was a French fry container, not a crumpled up hamburger wrapper. And I was just like, does he think I'm lying to the priest? Why does he have to check this? And that's kind of thing. It's like, you can make yourself crazy doing these things. They're disciplines. They're things that are supposed to help you. In this instance, it's supposed to, in the conversation, it's about pointing you in the direction of purity of heart, starting with this basic thing that you can do, food. But you can get crazy about this stuff, and you shouldn't have to. I'll have people that will come to me for confession during Lent, and they'll say things like, broke the fast. I'll say, well, what happened? Was on a business trip with a bunch of people, went to this big fancy restaurant. I didn't know what to eat, so I had a hamburger. And I said, well, don't worry about it. You were kind of stuck in that circumstance. Again, traditional Orthodox cultures and countries, when it was Great Lent, everything shut down, and you didn't have the big fancy restaurant that only had steaks and what have you. There are difficulties in doing it in our contemporary society. So, that's a look at blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. I have two reflection questions here. Do I strive for purity and holiness in the sight of God, looking to his blessed Son, Jesus Christ, as my example? Or do I spend my life and my heart with evil intentions, thoughts, acts, and pleasures? Then the second one, do I love my brother as myself, remembering that we are all equal in the sight of God? Or am I prejudiced against or cruel to those who may be different in any way, physically, emotionally, or mentally? So, that's kind of the look at those two. Questions or comments? I can drink some water. If not, I can get back to a couple of things that have come up in the last week in some of our conversations. It's coming. If I wait long enough.
I had this outstanding question about forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
A person every week says, "Forgive me." Is that better than saying, "I forgive you"? Do you want the example?
Please.
Okay.
It'll help.
Every Sunday, our now emeritus pastor comes out at a specific time of liturgy and says, "If I have angered anyone, or if I've sinned against you knowingly or unknowingly, please forgive me." But my question is, would it be better for him to have said, "I forgive you"? Because he's asking for our forgiveness.
Well,
because in the past, there was a person who, I begged forgiveness, and that person said no.
Yeah. So,
So what?
I mean, there's an element, I guess there is an element of these, what the priest in the example is doing, is landing in a different, I think that lands in a different category. I mean, something that, and I'll contextualize this a little bit. So one of the practices of our archdiocese, and so of course this parish, is Sunday before the beginning of Great Lent, Forgiveness Sunday.
Forgiveness Sunday, yes.
We have the Vesper service, Forgiveness Vespers. So liturgically, the service begins before Lent, and halfway through liturgically it transitions. So it's, in a sense, technically the first service of Great Lent. And we have in our archdiocese what's called the rite of mutual forgiveness, which is at the end. And so I'll come down. It's interesting, the chanters are chanting the canon of Pascha. So they're pointing ahead. We've started Great Lent, but the music you're hearing is pointing us in the direction of we're arriving at the resurrection. So it's kind of a dramatic contrast there. But I start and I make that, essentially that statement. But it's for the past year. We did this a year ago. I've tried my best to, if individually something's happened, but as a priest, publicly, I know that I can say things that can be taken the wrong way.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because I'm publicly speaking to a group of people. And I've had people who've maybe a week, month later say, "Father, you said this thing and it rubbed me the wrong way." And we'll have a conversation about it. But I'll make that statement. So it's as the spiritual father of this community, I'm asking for your forgiveness for anything that I've done in the last year. And then we continue. So each person comes up, and so I'll say, "Forgive me, a sinner," and they say, "God forgives." And then they'll say to me, "Forgive me, a sinner," and I respond back. So we ask each other for forgiveness. So in that part, that tends to be more on the personal level. Now, so two pieces left. So that's the priest piece, and kind of how I would contextualize the priest piece. In terms of asking people to forgive you, that sort of thing typically would be something specific. So you have the sense, I did this thing to this person and I need to ask for their forgiveness. That's when we ask people for their forgiveness, when we've identified something. Or if someone has come to you as a good Christian and in a spirit of Christian love, and you're receiving them in the spirit of Christian love, and they say, "You've done something to me that has hurt me." And then you can respond and say, "Well, please forgive me for that. I own up to that. I'm sorry." That's how it should work. Now, the difficulty is the example that you gave, where you were trying to ask someone to forgive you and they were like, not having it?
Not even knowing what I had done. That was even worse.
So they didn't know what you had done, or?
The person didn't want to speak to me, didn't want me to
Okay.
speak to the children.
Mm-hmm. And so that kind of comes to this thing about,
You know, what did I do?
yeah.
I am who I am, but
Yeah.
what did I do?
And so in circumstances like that, and this can be the sort of thing where, I mean, I'm not speaking for this person, but
you can't.
a circumstance where I'm so angry at this person because of this thing that they did to me, but I know I should forgive them. If that's there at all, the person in that circumstance should be trying to get to the point where they can address that with the other person.
But it will never happen. The person is deceased now.
And so that's the difficulty.
Yeah.
Is that there are circumstances where something has happened, someone's angry, they won't tell you why they're angry, they won't try and reconcile
Right.
at all.
Right.
And so the best that you can do is pray for them. Because, again, it gets into the free will thing. They chose not to do anything.
Well, this is it, and I wouldn't allow this person to live in my head.
Yeah.
I had to get on with my life.
Yeah. And so that's the difficulty. You can pray for people. They could be on a list somewhere, but they don't have to live in your head.
You cannot force someone to forgive you.
Correct. That's the blessing and the curse of free will. You can do whatever you want, but sometimes the things that you can choose to do are not good things to do. And you can dig your heels in and be angry and cause turmoil. Just exacerbate it because you've chosen to do that.
Yes.
And if that's the person you're dealing with, you have a choice of how to deal with that circumstance. And often it is, well, I did my best. I'm receptive if they ever want to do this, but I can't make them.
Right.
That's where we get into trouble. We think we have to make people do things or,
It won't happen.
control behavior. And no, they have to choose their behavior. Yeah. So that was a good one. That's like in the trenches. How do we deal with this day to day sort of thing? Yeah, real life.
And I've seen so much of it.
Yeah.
Amongst people, and it's sad.
Yeah. And that is, I think one of the difficulties is quite often that is a behavior you see in church life. So you can have fellow parishioners who will interact on that level and can be mean and nasty. Their fellow parishioners see it. People who are visiting, maybe they're not even Christian and might be interested in the church, they see that and they're like, what are these hypocrites doing? They talk about this stuff and then they turn around and act this way. And my answer is, well, we're a hospital. We're a spiritual hospital, and currently we have sheep and goats, and sometimes the goats are butting their heads. But we work with them, we pray for them, and all of that. So, other thoughts or comments about this?
That was emotional enough.
Okay. Well, a couple of things that. One of these things was something that came up towards the end. We were talking about the Beatitudes within the context of the church services. And I kind of did a hand wavy. I know it happens at some point during Holy Week. And so, my first intuition, I know I voiced this, was Thursday night, 12 Passion Gospel service.
Right.
And I checked, and it is.
It is in there?
And so where it is, and it's very dramatic. So, of course, that service, 12 Passion Gospels, we read everything in all four Gospels about Christ's betrayal, the trial, his scourging, going to the cross, being on the cross until he dies. All very dramatic.
That is probably the most emotional service of the week.
Yeah, and it's here we have low attendance, and I think part of that is it's a long service, but I think that's the other part too. It's a difficult one for people to participate in. So where we have the Beatitudes is about midway through the service. There is a point where I have a large cross up here, not quite life size, but it's about this high, and there's a stand here, and so I come out. So it's kind of like a liturgy, a great entrance. So I have the cross, and there's a hymn I sing. Today he is suspended on the tree, he who suspended the earth on the waters. That's kind of how it begins. So it's this whole thing about the creator of the universe being put on a cross. Come up, put the cross in the stand, and then there's an icon of Christ being crucified. And I put that on the cross. And then the next gospel reading is the first reading of Christ being put on the cross. And so it's this thing of, in human terms, the lowest point, because he's been tortured, he's put on the cross, and he's now in the process of dying. And then we sing the Beatitudes. And so it's doing a reversal there and saying this is a horrible, miserable thing, but ultimately it's about his kingdom, which overcomes all of this, and it's in these terms. So that's when that happens during Holy Week. So that's related to the Beatitudes. The other one, this was a coffee hour question. I was having a conversation with Raymond about this. The resurrection icon. And this is something he pointed out that I had never noticed before. He said there are all these people around Christ. Some have halos and some don't. Why? And so I did some digging, and I had inconclusive results. Inconclusive. Because I just said, well, clearly the ones with the halos are like Old Testament saints. And I said, well, maybe this is, the ones that aren't are living witnesses, contemporary to this event. What I found is it's not explained, but what is explained is this is Christ going to Hades. Yeah. So there are not living people around. So the best I can conclude, because part of what it talks about is who you typically see around Christ in here. So, of course, the obvious one is the man and the woman that are being pulled out of Hades are Adam and Eve. And so it's saying that thing of, original sin in the fall, it's basically been fixed. Sin, suffering, and death entering the world. Here's the path out, Jesus Christ. So them, but what I've identified is the two on the left, the one in the foreground with the crown, King David. It's kind of hard to see behind. I'm assuming the one behind him is King Solomon, because they'll say that, because they're the two main Old Testament kings. And then, of course, in the foreground is, next to him is John the Forerunner. And in larger versions of this icon, you'll see other people like Abel, who was, the first person who was murdered in history. The three youths who were in the fiery furnace in the book of Daniel. And so it'll say there are certain people that typically appear to kind of make this point. So my educated guess at this point, I'm going to look at some other sources and see if I can find something. My educated guess is, I think we've made the assumption that everyone in Hades is a saint, but the idea is that everyone who's departed is there. So that's kind of the thing. If you take a global historical perspective, it's not just land of the dead for the Jewish, but land of the dead for everyone. And they've been waiting for the resurrection because everything fell as a result of Adam and Eve. Salvation started through the Jews, and of course through Christ's death and resurrection, but the message there is universal, and that it's allowing for everyone out. So my assumption is they're just departed people. They're not saints. I'll have to confirm that. But that's what I was able to find doing internet research this afternoon. I have some books at home I still want to crack into and see if I can find something.
Speak to an iconographer. I can't even pronounce it. Those who paint icons.
I'll have to track one down.
I know one.
Maybe the only one I know here locally is Dennis Bell. I don't know if you know Dennis.
There's Michael, I can't think of his last name always. Give me a while.
Okay. Okay. So, well, that's what I have for this evening. When we return for our fourth and final session, we'll look at the last 3 Beatitudes, because they kind of work together. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are those who revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. So, that's where we are. Thank you, everyone.